Okay, Cindy, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Still on. There we go.
Right, Anna, are we all set?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Columbia University. It's a great pleasure to have a distinguished guest today, like a good friend of Columbia who's been here so many times. I'm introducing him in a couple of minutes. Today, we are talking about a very urgent topic, I would say. A theme that has been discussed in both in policy circles, but everyone who's been following what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. More specifically for this class, we are going to be discussing the economic impact, not only on the Brazilian economy, but also on the global context. We all know that there are several indications that what the conflict in Europe is going to have reverberations all over the world. Fortunately or unfortunately, the impact in Brazil is going to be perhaps less pronounced, and one of the reasons that we're having these discussions today, in which way their channel of transmission through which Brazil is going to be impacted. Right? So our guest speaker today, Dr. Ottaviano Canuto, who has been coming to Columbia for what, like 15 years now, maybe almost 20, I would say. Right?
Yes, 18.
Excellent. And Dr. Canuto is probably the Brazilian with the most experienced international organizations. In DC, he is widely known not only because of his knowledge of the Brazilian economy, but also on all issues related to international economics. And to a great extent because he has this unique background in where he combines an outstanding academic positions as professor of Unicamp and University of São Paulo, two leading schools, universities in Brazil, but also with a long career both in government and international organizations. He started his public functions as Deputy Minister of International Affairs in the Brazilian Minister of Finance. And from there, he took over positions at the World Bank as an executive director for a couple of times, as an executive director at the International Monetary Fund. He was a vice president of World Bank, also vice president at the Inter-American Development Bank. So you can see that he has a very extensive track record and someone who knows what's going on, not only from a theoretical standpoint, but also someone who's been an actual practitioner who knows things from the inside. So it's a great pleasure to have once again Dr. Ottaviano Canuto back here in the classroom. So Ottaviano, thanks so much for joining us once again.
God bless you. Thank you. Thank you, Sydney, for having me here. It's really a pleasure. The pandemic interrupted my physical visit here to Colombia. And well, the topic is not necessarily a pleasant one, but I believe it is quite important. We have been through 1 month of this war, but it may become a turning point in some key aspects of the international economy, together with the pandemic as well. And so it is worth trying to understand and to gauge the likely implications of this war, at least as a roadmap to understand what's coming and how to get ready to it. It's obviously the tragedy and the losses, human lives, and destruction on the ground in Ukraine is the most regrettable thing. But what I will carry today here is an attempt to depict which will be most likely the channels through which the war will bring impacts economic impacts on the global economy, on the rest of the country. So basically, what I will do is to outline three main channels of transmission of the crisis. And then we go about how it is that those impacts, that matrix of impacts, affects in a country-specific way the countries outside. I will make a distinction between what's going on in Europe and the United States, particularly because the war is coming at the time and in ways that has aggravated the main dilemmas faced by economic policy making in these two countries. But then I will say something about the emerging markets and developing economies, where the impacts will be very much differentiated. As Sydney appropriately observed in the beginning, the impacts may be limited in a country like Brazil that is heavily reliant on commodities, but at the end of the day, the impact is not as dramatic as it might become if that's something to be on the horizon. On the poor countries, on low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and other parts of the world where the risks of famine crisis may be looming with disruption in the market. When I say that the war may be a turning point in some key aspects, I have in mind the following. Geopolitics has come to the fore as with respect to not only the trade globalization trends that we have been watching in the previous period, some of the trends towards relative deglobalization that we have seen as a result of the pandemic, aggravating tendencies that were there before, even before, since the global financial crisis. But obviously, for obvious reasons, this sitting at the throne of by geopolitics on trade relations will be aggravated as a result of the war. And as well, and that includes the geopolitics with respect to some key inputs, to some key commodities. Because if you guys heard so much about supply chain disruptions last year, right? It became subject of headlines at CNN and so on. You will expect for more as a result of the war. And this is quite important given I will try to illustrate this by referring to some key inputs that are even supplied globally by Russia and Ukraine. Okay, so that's the idea. Next.
Yeah, next slide, please.
Next slide. Yes, great. So which would be those channels of transmission? Basically, the weaponization of finance. Yes.
The slides.
We can't see them.
Yeah, so I have to look at that the other direction.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry for that. Yeah. You have to look there.
Okay, great. So one of them is obviously the weaponization of finance without precedence in terms of scope and reach. As well, I think in the case of the emerging market developing countries, the commodity price shocks derived from the war and the supply chain disruptions. Next, why am I saying weaponization of finance? Look, clearly Russia, Mr. Putin tried to prepare the ground before the invasion of Ukraine. Those like me who keep track all the time on what's happening with global reserves and so on, it called my attention. It's been calling my attention since the Crimea war, since the invasion of Crimea, how systematically the central bank of Russia was getting rid of U.S. securities, reserves in dollars, and buying gold as well as increasing for the first time, buying Chinese securities in renminbi. To some extent, the degree of escape from the dollar did not happen in the case of the euro, but it was clear how Russia was getting rid of its exposure to US dollar securities. So, and to some extent, we can see the reasons after the war in Ukraine even follow. Most likely, Mr. Putin did not count on the degree of extent to which the sanctions were implemented on Russia. You know, sanctions had been already used by the US in Iran, Venezuela, but the extent to which isolating the central bank was, let's say, for a large case like Russia, had no precedence. Incapacitating the central bank to operate, which means the following: the ownership of the remaining of the remaining dollars in the central bank coffers, and as you can see in this chart, say the increase in gold, the reduction in U.S. dollar titles, but still with some increase in euros and the other and yuan, the Chinese appear there. But even that remaining, let's say, ownership of assets in dollars or in euros as well, that you see there was not denied. The money remains Russian. The only practical question is the following: Russian has no access to it, cannot use it. So in practical terms, it's been confiscated. And that was a very unexpected and severe sanction with some caveats. Of course, in order to get the agreement among the Europeans and Americans and Japanese and so on, the demand by the Germans and the Dutch, the ones who are heavily dependent on the Russian gas. Next, please. And as you can see in this, in the next one, please. In this chart, what I'm referring to, look at this. Look at the dependence on imports of gas from Russia that has been developed in the last few years in the Eurozone. Look at the share in red there of the gas coming from Russia. And given that dependence, and you don't change this from night to day, think of the offer by the US of liquefied natural gas. Okay, but there's not enough LNG here to replace that quantity from night to day, nor there is storage capacity in Europe to make that possible. So the constraints on shifting that composition are so intense that the European side of the coalition insisted on keeping the flows under normal circumstances with respect to paying for the imports of gas. This is story still unfolding, as we all know. There has been the pressure by everybody else for Europe to establish an embargo on the gas, and even if that's a shoot on its own foot in terms of rationing, but there are plans on how to go rationing. Russia might ultimately as well threaten and say, "Okay, I'm gonna block the pipeline and impede the transfer of gas." So you have some possibilities down there, and that's what makes the whole thing complex and tense. But the point is understood in that chart. But so far, and then you have the news. Yesterday, news were great about possible results, and then game being drawn out in Istanbul, and then even the price of gas and oil reflected that. But then you have other news today about or yesterday about other movements. So it's unclear. We are in this, but could we return to the previous chart, please? Thank you. No, the previous one, if I may, is no the previous.
Yes.
Give
Yeah.
me 1 second.
Okay, great. Sorry for that. But it's to show you I have to put the consequences of the sanctions on Russia, on the Russian economy, to complete the picture. And they are big. Yes, thank you. Look, the Russian GDP is expected, the last estimates that I got from the IIF, using leading indicators and so on, point to a decline of Russia's GDP above 15% this year. Can you imagine this? It's the GDP that falls 15% in a year. Because in the second quarter, when the major impact happens, and that's what is depicted in the left side chart, the GDP of Russia in annual terms will decline more than 35%. It's a deep impact. I call this in a previous, it's 1 month, but I have already written a couple of things about the subject. One of my first pieces I compared what's happening, the war, the weaponization of finance, as a boxing fight. In a boxing fight, both sides receive the impact, but the winner is the one that is more resistant, that receives the least impactful jabs. So there will be some impact on the outside as well, but nothing comparable to what's happening because of Russia. And that's what, if I may, next, that's exactly what I'm trying to convey with these charts that you will see. Yes. Look, obviously, under conditions of uncertainty and the impact of the sanctions and so on, the immediate impact is at the end of the chart was an uplift in the risk premium of U.S. 3-month commercial paper rates. All the assets, not something yet as dramatic as it happened in March of 2020 because of the pandemic, and then comes the Federal Reserve Bank and everything cools down. But the immediate impact was remarkable. Next one, please. Including a flight from risk assets that we watched immediately in the first 2 weeks after the invasion. See, this is dynamic. A phenomenon has happened in the last 2 weeks, which appears to be an accommodation of financial markets with respect to the risk premium and so on, and things have behaved reasonably well. The point that I want to make, yeah, I'm ready. The point I want to make is that, of course, even if financially speaking, there was a shock that has, let's say, been accommodated, it doesn't mean that additional shocks cannot come down the road. So much about the financial. Let me move on to the commodity price. Next, please. The second channel of transmission is exactly, for obvious reasons, commodity price. You can move on. Given please next. Given the relevance of Russia as an oil producer and as a gas producer, not by chance you see what has happened with respect to the price of crude oil and with the natural gas, particularly in Europe. The U.S. is a different case because the U.S. is almost self-sufficient when it comes to energy. Whereas Europe, as you saw, is highly dependent on the imports from Russia. Next, please. Yes, next. Let me try to be faster. This is just to show to you the weight of the Russian exports of oil which comprise, at least back in 2021, they corresponded to 8% of the world's exports. And 8% of the world exports of oil vanishing from night to day is not something, let's say, that will take slightly. And as you can see, the sanctions, and by the way, when we talk about sanctions, not only the financial sanctions, but the voluntary sanctions established by companies. It's remarkable how all major world cargo companies declared that they would stay very far from the Russian ports. Besides the implications of a belligerent situation with Turkey sending signals that they would not appreciate the presence of Russian ships in their space. So this appears in the sudden downfall of tankers, oil tankers across all Russian ports. Next. Well, the issue is the following: it's not only oil and gas, corn and wheat. The weight of Russia and Ukraine is not by chance that Ukraine is called the breadbasket of Europe, right? And immediately, given the relevance of Russia and Ukraine as a source of wheat, inevitably the price went to the moon. And when things happen to energy commodity price, it's a well-known fact that they end up being transmitted to other kinds of commodities as well. And you are watching as well an uprise in the price of metals. Important. Russia and Ukraine are relevant not only as wheat producers and oil and gas in the case of Russia, but also for some key metals. For instance, neon gas. You don't have the obligation to know what it is. Okay, does anybody know what neon gas is? I didn't until recently. Neon gas is fundamental to produce the silicon plates of semiconductors. While 50% of the world's supply of neon gas comes from Russia and Ukraine. 90% of the neon gas used by the US last year came from Ukraine. But the list goes on. Aluminium, palladium, nickel.
Pesticides in the case. Pesticides in the case of Russia.
Yes. Yeah.
Big thing.
Great. Good point. So, and all these inputs, they are key, particularly with respect to the electricity storage. And guess what? We are beginning the transition, the energy transition towards electric cars, and instead of gas or fossil fuel cars. And these key components, they have in Russia and Ukraine, in Belarus. Well, on top of that, fertilizers. A key producer of fertilizers, Russia and Ukraine. So next, please. So what we have is that, yes, can go next. I'm cutting through my, and not by chance, we have seen this. The rising agricultural price, particularly wheat, but also soy and corn. Next, please. And the rising metal price, copper, aluminum, nickel, and so on. So it's a tremendous commodity price shock that comes after a year in which the price of commodities had gone up significantly, particularly in the case of Europe. You know, last year, the inflation in Europe was basically the spike in inflation was due to rising energy price. Less so here in the case of the US. The fact of the matter is that on top of the recent trends, and we'll address those in a couple of minutes, we also have this additional shock of commodity price. Next, please. And supply chain disruptions. I don't have to tell the whole story here. There's no time for this, but remember, suddenly with the opening after after in the second phase of the pandemic, you have the combination of opening plus hefty transfers of income from governments, in the case of the US, in the case of Europe, in the case of France, and so on. You had a huge increase in demand, and with an important change in the composition. The families substituted their consumption of contact-intensive service, restaurants, tourism, with laptops and Netflix at home. So you had a switch in the demand. And guess what? A switch in demand that increased dramatically the demand for instance, semiconductors and other and electronics. And that led to congestion in ports as we all accompanied, lack of semiconductors, automobile companies disputing with laptop producers, with Apple, the access to semiconductors and so on. Guess what? Everything that we just mentioned about key inputs will be aggravated by the war. Semiconductors. Forget any normalization of semiconductors till next year. This issue has become so relevant, if I may, next, that the Fed of New York has developed an indicator that an index that let's say summarize the situation in terms of pressure on supply chains. And as you can see, it's not by chance that you see the supply chain disruptions peaking last year. And when we thought that it had reached the second peak and would go down, now we have a new wave. So supply chain disruptions are here probably to stay. Yes, please, next. I will have to run, no worries. Oh, yes, these are indicators. I can leave the slide here for you. And most of these slides are in the text that you saw. But it's just an illustration, something that came out on the IMF blog today about the shipping costs during the pandemic and which remain now being a pressure, a cost pressure on inflation. Yes, next. Okay, so let's look at the country-specific impacts. It is that, the US is Eurozone, and will be very economic in my reference to that, have been facing a dilemma, which is the following. The spike in inflation that took place in the US, in the Eurozone as well, was to a large extent, until recently, there were doubts whether they were expressing those inflation spikes simply supply chain restrictions, or whether they were also reflecting an over heating of their economies, particularly in the case of the US. Lax monetary policy for long, very let's say, generous fiscal policies and so on. We had this strong debate here. And what I can tell you is that the balance of opinions has tilted toward the acceptance that the US economy has been overheated. And I will show you some very fast, some indicators in that regard. If the whole inflation was only supply chain disruptions, but no excess demand, the most natural thing for a monetary policy to do would be, okay, cross your arms and let it pass. Okay, it will be painful while we have the price shocks, but as the supply chain disruptions fade out, the congestions are diminished, then the inflation will come down and you don't have to do very much. But if on the contrary, either because of fiscal and or monetary policy reasons, the economy is overheated, you have to turn the clock. And that mood, the change of that mood was quite clear when Jeremy Powell, the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank, the president, switched his gears end of last year. Well, it's no longer temporary and so on. The Federal Reserve Bank has already started its process of lifting the basic interest rates. Way to go before the Fed puts those interest rates in real terms on the positive side above inflation. But it is likely that the pace will increase. I'm among those who believe that the Fed will increase 50 basis points in the next meeting. And it will, the doubt is how far will it go in terms of recovering a positive level for the basic interest rates. And even in the Eurozone, one at the beginning of the year, Madame Lagarde was talking about don't expect any increase of rates in 2022. At least the other members of the board of the European Central Bank have already manifested a majority of opinions that at least the quantitative easing in the Eurozone will have to be shortened. It will have to start. The quantitative tightening will have to start before it was expected, and so on. So the mood clearly moved from lax policies to tightening. Now, the question is, at the same time, and there is a degree of financial leverage that has been the result of so many years of low interest rates and so on, that once in a while someone manifests the fear that if the pace of interest rates goes too fast and too high, you may crumble the whole thing. And that's why everyone is guessing in that regard. I can tell you scientifically, no one can claim to say that's going to happen if the interest rates goes there. But we have this debate, and that's why my paper calls attention to the risks of stagflation. If you go too high, too strong beyond the point, you may delve the U.S. economy and the Eurozone economy into a recession, even right, not right. That's why the Fed, like the European Central Bank, will have to cross the river, like the Chinese used to say, stepping stone by stone in order to avoid. And Rubini, for instance, in a piece today at the Project Syndicate, says maybe they will have to abdicate of one of the targets, one of the things. Either they abdicate of financial stability or they abdicate of curbing inflation. And obviously, the reason I'm going through this is to say that one of the consequences of the war in Ukraine will be is already being the exacerbation of that dilemma, of that problem in policy. And the charts that follow illustrate that. But I'm gaining time because I have to cut. Well, in the case of emerging market developing economies, of course, the impacts will depend a lot on whether the country is a commodity exporter, particularly of which commodities. Oil exporters are smiling, very happy. But they will have to cope anyway with the domestic impacts of rising oil price. Brazil, who has become close to an exporter and so on, for instance, it will not be that much affected in terms of trade, in terms of by what's happening with the oil price. Regions in the world who are food importers, they will suffer. They're suffering a blow. The whole North Africa is highly dependent on wheat, given the features of their cuisine. Wheat coming from Russia and Ukraine. I was in Morocco on work 2 weeks ago, and I heard reference to the fact that maybe the wheat price rise was one of the triggers of the Spring Revolution. Remember? You guys are too young to remember, but there was a spring. So this is serious stuff. And the World Bank has approached the risks not only in terms of debt, but also in terms of food scarcity in parts of the world. There, it may be serious. In the case of Latin America, as I said, you have difference. Colombia is liking the oil price increase, Chile less so, but ultimately the region is feeling the impact not through the financial channel, but through the supply chain disruptions Brazil will be extremely affected because of the uncertainty regarding fertilizers. And fertilizer, particularly for the next harvest, is not for the one that is coming out. And it may affect the Brazilian production of agriculture. But basically, you can approach each country according to exactly how the country fits into the commodities suffering shocks and fertilizers and so on. Yes, yes. Let me use my let's say, just 5 minutes at least on. If I go next, we're gonna jump several slides. Yes, just to show you, see, there was inflation. Next, how active has been the U.S. economy in favor of the opinion of over 18. Next, the issue of the Great Resignation, which seems to be fading out, at least in relative terms. Great Resignation, right? It was another fashion word last year. It has diminished, not entirely disappeared, but it's still there. And it was associated with the transfer payments. Okay, next. Yeah, okay. Next, just to illustrate to you guys, the same thing in the Eurozone seemed to be getting speed, then it comes the war. Yes, please, next. The price expectation is going through the roof. This is just an illustration of the dilemma that I was referring to. Next. 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 This is an indicator that I said about the potential fragility when it comes to financial instruments. But the last 2 weeks, this has stabilized. Yes, next. Let me move on to Brazil. Next. Sorry for taking this time. Next. See, but as you can see, look, it hits so differently the emerging markets and developing economies, depending on the basket of exports, particularly commodities. Next. But those are the poor. Look at this. The share of consumer goods with the share in consumer price index. And as you can see, the poorer you are, the more hit you will be by rising food price. Next. Next. Yeah, sorry for this, trying to be in Portuguese, but it's to illustrate how the supply chain constraints affected last year and even until February this year, the Brazilian companies. We had closure of automobile plants in Brazil because of lack of semiconductors, for instance. So Brazil was affected, intends to be affected particularly. Next, you'll see there, it's in Portuguese, but you understand. See the share of countries in the imports of fertilizers in Brazil. Russia was responsible for 23.3% of Brazilian fertilizers last year. You don't change that from night to day. It's going to be a tremendous shock. Next. Inflation. Okay, so which will be the impacts on the Brazilian economy? One, obviously, is already in place, is the spike in inflation. A year in which the Brazilian inflation has been high, 2-digit. Obviously, Bolsonaro is desperate to find ways to mitigate the impact of the oil prices on the domestic price of gasoline, fired the president of Petrobras, and now they're talking about combining subsidies and so on, because this, of course, hit directly the pocket of the poor, the price of domestic gas, and also the food. And that's why you have seen a high spike on inflation, and which may get worse depending on whether we have successive shocks before us. So inflation, the war has been bad. Please, next. Yes, next. This is the expectations by the market, showing how the market is already. But on the trade balance, it will be good, of course. Ultimately, in terms of trade, rising price will benefit the Brazilian trade, and also even in terms of current account debts. Please, next. So on the balance of payment side, Brazil will be fine. The challenge will be the inflation, particularly. Next. And as we saw last year, the fiscal balance benefits from higher inflation because of the impact on the expenditures, and while at the same time the lift that it provides to tax revenues and so on. So fiscally speaking, is going to be good. The effect in Brazil. Next. Yes. Well, the growth will remain mediocre. Those are the expectations by the market, right? As expressed in the focus. And as you can see, slightly above zero. It's really, but in order to approach this, the point that I want to make is that, see, the war in Ukraine will not affect that much. In order to approach that, we have to go into structural issues and so on. But yes, next. Unemployment, yes, next. Yeah, I have to give some time. So the point, but let me close on this. Look, so as you can see, it's not a case to draw headlines in terms of major impacts. But on the other hand, let me hammer on the following. The pandemic had already led to dramatic repositioning of national policies with respect to value chains, to global value chains. Now, if you think of utility function, if you think of objective function with weights attributed to cost efficiency and to resilience, to security, the balance has tilted in favor of abdicating of some efficiency in order to have more resilience. That will vary sector by sector. It's obvious that when it comes to medical equipment and medicines, the balance tilted dramatically towards lower vulnerability. Everyone will now, the fears, the revelation of the dependence on China and India on those subjects will certainly lead to some import substitution in the rest of the world. The similar reasoning will apply to some things. It's not by chance that President Biden's package on semiconductors got easily the bipartisan support. Is Build Back Better? No. The other package, he faced competition, but there was no opposition to the one on semiconductors. And you're going to watch. So this tilt in the balance has obviously been accentuated with the war. But also, not to speak only of finance, my article yesterday was about the impacts of the war on the dollar predominance, on the dollar domination. I'm skeptical about revolutions in that regard, but anyway, people are looking at everyone paid attention to the sanctions. The sanctions, as I said, were really a very bold step, not enough to break the whole thing, but things will be different. And in the key commodities, particularly the key commodities that are not standardized and don't have a market fully developed, as it is the case of gas and oil, but which will nevertheless will be relevant in the future. Just to give it an idea. An electric car use 6 times more copper than a fossil fuel car. Imagine this: as you change the fleet, the demand for fossil fuels will diminish, but the demand for nickel, copper, everything that is good for storage of electricity will go to the moon. Cobalt, same thing. By the way, today I only saw the headlines. President Biden thinking of enacting an emergency measure with respect to cobalt here in the US. They're going to have a race, which may, well, it will not be a return to the 19th century imperialism, but the pressure around the source of these things will really go to the roof. Think of a country like DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, where you even have Russian militias there helping to extract cobalt, because DRC has 70% of the mapped reserves in the world of cobalt. And cobalt is so. And obviously, an environment such as the one associated with the war will exacerbate this even more. And we should look at our agents and the risk and the temptations for people like Bolsonaro to go on with opening the way for mining in indigenous lands in Amazon. This kind of danger will increase over time. Thank you. Sorry for this.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Professor Ottaviano. It's a great masterclass, and you provide a lot of food for thought, especially on themes that are very familiar to us from Latin America. So let's get started with something that's very provocative, right? The idea that there might be a renewed interest in industrial policies.
Yes.
Do you think that that can trigger some governments across the region, since we're talking about Latin America in particular? Do you think that we might be seeing some initiatives towards things that we used to see in the 70s?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Fantastic. And by the way, I co-wrote with Justin Ning, a former chief economist of the World Bank, my ex-colleague and friend, and with Pipne Zhang, also a Chinese economist today at the Atlantic Council, a project syndicate on this. Our objective in our project syndicate, the original title was Hope or Hoax, was to call attention to there is this fever, and it's a high temperature fever. But what we do in the article, short article, is to highlight what would it take for it to work out, because it may be a disaster. We have gone this way in the past with our import substitution policy in the region, and the results we know clearly have been very, very below optimal. So we outline what has to be in place, criteria of selection of champions, if that's the case, time-bound establishment of incentives so as not to create overdependency. We go there, and not to be stupidly ambitious. There's no way to imagine that Brazil will, at this moment, would become a front-runner producer of semiconductors, like Taiwan. So you have to be realistic. But having said that, we play our role. The fact of the matter, look, guys, you cannot imagine what 3 years ago I was here in an event in New York, and a guy was selling to the audience how the U.S.-China rivalry, it was the time of Mr. Trump's wars and so on, would create an opportunity for Latin America to substitute China. And the enthusiasm that I saw in the audience by the guys from Central America was, it makes all sense in the case of Mexico. In Mexico, indeed, partially some of these segments that went out of China when you had the first hit by President Trump, went to Thailand, went particularly to Vietnam, Cambodia, but also partly Mexico seized the opportunity. Another thing is why today now Nicaragua or El Salvador to become a replacement for China. But the enthusiasm is there. Colombia was very much enthusiastic because of the special relationship that has with the US and so on. And indeed, and it will come. It will vary. It will vary, particularly if Mr. Biden had, let's say, given some priority, he may down the road to some sort of a regional, deep inside the border trade agreement, which some of us even hope that they might do that, in order to coerce, for instance, Bolsonaro in Brazil to accept environmental standards, including the Amazon. I can't say that, but yeah, if it was a Brazilian, maybe if you have a trade agreement like this with a penalty if you do not abide to those things, that might help. That will be a positive agenda. That might help, but it has not been a priority so far. But obviously, maybe in some segments, the customers of the value chains will decide to diversify, not to be overly dependent only on one part, and that may be scope for that. But again, it has to be well done. Otherwise, it's a waste of money, as we have done in the past.
Absolutely. And since we're talking about history, let's go back to 2008 in the financial crisis. Right? At that time, that was where the height of the commodities boom, and Brazil, in that particular moment, was less affected by what was happening around the world. But at the same time, like the impact hit the country later.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that we discussed here is that because of, for several reasons, like due to channels of transmission, Brazil might be less impacted now
Yes.
by the crisis. Can we expect another tsunami down the road?
I would say that to some extent, what things that happened to Brazil afterwards, the decline in the realm of prices, were due not to the international system, but due to things that were done by Brazil itself. But they were deceitful, indeed. Let me tell you a short story. It has to do with last time that I was, one of the times I was here recently, which is the following. Back in 2009, 2010, when I was a vice president at the World Bank, I myself got so enthusiastic about the different outcomes of emerging markets in the advanced economies. See, yeah, the advanced economies, they're self-inflicted their financial crisis, and now they're gonna, spend some time healing and so on. But look at the emerging markets. The emerging markets, well, they're booming. The conversations at the time were things about instead of what were the expression? Decoupling or reverse coupling and so on. And I published a book together with 30 colleagues at the World Bank. I offered the hypothesis of even the possibility of a switchover of global locomotives. You know what? It's not really decoupling them. While the advanced economies will remain in prison with their, suffering the hangover of their financial crisis. Look at how Brazil, the BRICS, China, and Russia, they all keep growing. So they may even, rescue the advanced economies. Of course, that wasn't over enthusiasm because this country later on, we underestimated the weight of China. We underestimated the damage that the emerging markets would do to themselves. Hubris. We don't need reforms. Reforms are no longer needed. And it fell down. The reason I remember this is the following. I have published 5 books after that. But when I came here in the debate, how about that book of yours of 2010? They put me on the wrong enthusiastic call that I made in 2010. So we all had that we underestimated the degree of hubris. Brazil is a very good case in that regard. Brazil did the right thing in the first rule of government, got the investment rate, then comes the crisis, and then comes that feeling, now, you know what, look at this global financial crisis showing how these guys are not, have not necessarily good policy. And we need to do more. And then we ended up on the new economic matrix, the outcome of which was simply higher debt, not necessarily higher investments of the private sector, and a situation of fragility that ended up leading to the crisis. So the point is that the harm we did to ourselves. That includes Brazil.
I'm afraid that we might be doing the same thing again.
See, well,
Yeah, the last question before we finalize this part of the class is that to what extent some of the impact of the war might be reversible or not in the short, medium, and long run?
ultimately, that will depend on the speed with which the war is finished. And obviously, as well, the way it is finished. Definitely, if we had, which seems unlikely, the scenario, what Mr. Putin maybe thought that they would solve in 1 week, it wouldn't, the sanction would remain, and we would still have a breakdown of the international trade order. One may be more optimistic if the obvious way out, the so-called end game plot is reached, which I imagine would be something like Ukraine pledges neutrality with respect to the NATO, but being not forbidden to join the European Union, that is to say, benefit economically speaking for the time being. And the doubt is how much of the eastern and southern Ukraine Russia will demand as part of the result. Crimea, obviously, he will claim that it's Russian and Donbass. The sooner the conflict ends, obviously, the faster the normalization of the supply of everything that we saw happens. We have doubts on how the sanctions will play, to what extent they will be reversed or not. But it ultimately depends on the war itself.
All right, so we are finishing the first part of the class that is being live streamed through Facebook, through YouTube,